Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moral Critic channel, the channel where we analyze, critique, conclude, and arrive to the truth based on objective criteria. In today's video, I am going to start a new series entitled Literature. As simple as that. I may think of another title, but for now, that's the idea that I have. And just as it suggests, it's just going to handle literature, be it English, which means British, American, and even Arabic, whether it is poetry, short stories, or novels. Mainly classical, all right? There are many web novels now. I'm not so much of a fan, even though I have written one. But the kind of novels that I enjoy are classical ones. Anyways, I'm starting this series for two reasons. The first reason is that I simply enjoy reading literature. I'm very much interested in that, and it's one of the few things that I still get enjoyment out of reading or writing. So that's the main reason. It's purely for entertainment. The second reason is that maybe it would help people, especially university students who are enrolling in English studies and specifying in literature. Maybe they could benefit and learn a thing or two out of this. Obviously, I'm not a point of reference, but I I know some things about literature, whether it is literary theory or how to write a good piece of literature. All right, that's it. I have some guests here, but unlike the other series, it's completely optional to participate in this. You can just sit and listen to me reading this short story. But if you would like to participate, then that would be great also. So, the first piece of literature that I thought would be a great start is one that I consider the best short story of all time, in my opinion. At least from the ones that I read, and I read quite a few. But this one is the one that I found much enjoyment and even admiration whenever I think about it or read it. This is probably the fifth time that I read it, and it's always like the first time. Never gets old. Maybe it helps that I read it once a year, maybe, but still. And that is Rappaccini's daughter. Now, I would like to mention that I will make this session only a read-along session. I'm not going to get into detail about the themes of the story, the analysis, the lessons that we learn. Maybe I can mention that, but that's not the main focus. What we will do here in this session is simply reading, maybe trying to explain some difficult words, maybe reflecting upon some scenes in the short story. And also, I would like to give the viewer an idea about how to write or how to read a piece of literature. What is the best reading or writing experience that you can have? All right, without any further ado, I'm going to start reading. I apologize beforehand if I make some mistakes while reading. My tongue sometimes betrays me, but I will do my best. So the title is Rappaccini's Daughter. The first thing before we start reading the actual story, we should take a moment and reflect upon this title. Why did the author make it this way? Or what is he trying to insinuate? What is he trying to make the reader think about? So Rappaccini's Daughter. First thing we notice is that it's a name. It's a name of a person, Rappaccini. And he has a daughter. Obviously, that's the first thing that you can get out of the title. However, why did he not say the opposite? For example, the daughter has a name, obviously. Why didn't he call her by her name and say the father of the name of this daughter? This is a question. And certainly the author did not do it arbitrarily, without intention. So this is the first lesson that you should get, is that while dealing with literature, nothing is arbitrary. Everything is done by design. It's there on purpose. At least in essence, in theory, it should have a purpose. So that's how you should start your reading experience. By assuming that everything that you encounter in this piece of work has a purpose. Alright, now let's start. A young man named Giovanni Guasconti came very long ago from the more southern region of Italy to pursue his studies at the University of Padua. Giovanni, who had but a scanty supply of gold ducats in his pocket, took lodgings in a high and gloomy chamber of an old edifice, which looked not unworthy to have been the palace of a Paduan noble, and which, in fact, exhibited over its entrance the armorial bearings of a family long since extinct. Let's explain some difficult words. Scanty, it means little or insufficient. Ducats is the currency that used to exist in Middle Age Europe up to the 19th century. And what else? I think that's it. I'm trying to pronounce the names with Italian accents, so please do not cringe. The young stranger, who was not unstudied in the great poem of his country, recollected that one of the ancestors of this family, and perhaps an occupant of this very mansion, had been pictured by Dante as a partaker of the immortal agonies of his Inferno. So this is a reference to an infamous novel, Dante's Inferno, which tells the story of Dante, who goes to hell, basically. Obviously, this is done or said from a Christian perspective. It's Christian folklore. And even within Christianity, it's not taken as very accurate. Anyways, again, why did the author mention this? Why did he link between the two? You should always ask why. So he went out of his way to make a reference to this, even though the story does not have anything to do with that. So that's done on purpose, and it has a reason. These reminiscences and associations, together with the tendency to heartbreak natural to a young man for the first time out of his native sphere, caused Giovanni to sigh heavily, and he looked around the desolate and ill-furnished apartment. Holy Virgin, Signor, cried old Dame Elisabetta. Between parentheses, Holy Virgin, they are talking about the Virgin Mary, peace be upon her. And this is what? This is invoking her blessing, her spirit. And this is a form of polytheism. Now, Christianity claims that it is a monotheistic religion and that they do not worship the Virgin Mary. But how can you invoke her blessings if you do not believe that? And there is an interesting instance where and when Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah was debating some Christian scholars about this very doing, about invoking the Spirit and asking the saints, etc. Not only for the Virgin Mary, they do that for all the saints, Saint Peter, Saint Luke, etc. And at the end of that debate, the Christian scholars agreed that it is a form of polytheism, even within Christianity itself. Because that's the debate. The debate was that even within Christianity, you are disbelievers. And at the end, they agreed with it. Anyways, that's not here nor there. Let's continue. Who, won by the youth's remarkable beauty of person, was kindly endeavoring to give the chamber a habitable air. What a sight that was to come out of a young man's heart! Do you find this old mansion gloomy? For the love of heaven, then, put your head out of the window, and you will see as bright sunshine as you have lips in Naples. So Giovanni came from Naples to Padua. To do what? To continue his studies. We are not yet given the timeline, but we can guess. Goscati mechanically did as the old woman advised, but could not quite agree with her that the Lombard sunshine was as cheerful as that of southern Italy. Such as it was, however, it fell upon a garden beneath the window, and expanded its fostering influences on a variety of plants, which seemed to have been cultivated with exceeding care. Does this garden belong to the house? Asked Giovanni. Heaven forbid, signor, unless it were fruitful of better pot herbs than any that grow there now, answered old Elizabeth. No, that garden is cultivated by the own hands of Signor Giacomo Rappaccini, the famous doctor, who, I warrant him, has been heard of as far as Naples. It is said he distills these plants into medicines that are as potent as a charm. Oftentimes you may see the Signor Doctor at work, and perchance the Signora his daughter, too, gathering the strange flowers that grow in the garden. Here we are introduced to two other characters, which are Giacomo Rappaccini, the title, and his daughter, also the title. So maybe these are the main characters, or maybe not, because the story is starting with Giovanni. Another possibility is that the plot revolves around these two. They may not be the main characters, but sometimes you can make the plot revolve on something that is not existent in every part of the story. Sometimes that's the best way to do it. Giovanni still found no better occupation than to look down into the garden beneath his window. From its appearance, he judged it to be one of those botanic gardens which were of earlier date in Padua than elsewhere in Italy or in the world. Or not improbably, it might once have been the pleasure place of an opulent family, for there was the ruin of a marble fountain in the center, sculptured with rare art, but so woefully shattered that it was impossible to trace the original design from the chaos of remaining fragments. The water, however, continued to gush and sparkle into the sunbeams as cheerfully as ever. A little gurgling sound ascended to the young man's window, and made him feel as if a fountain were an immortal spirit that sung its song unceasingly, and without heeding the vicissitudes around it, while one century embodied it in marble, and another scattered the perishable garniture on the soil. All about the pool into which the water subsided grew various plants that seemed to require a plentiful supply of moisture for the nourishment of gigantic leaves, and in some instances, flowers gorgeously magnificent. There was one shrub in particular, set in a marble vase in the midst of the pool, that bore a profusion of purple blossoms, each of which had the lustre and richness of a gem, and the whole together made a show so resplendent that it seemed enough to illuminate the garden. Even had there been no sunshine, every portion of the soil was peopled with plants and herbs, which, if less beautiful, still bore tokens of assiduous care, as if all had their individual virtues, known to the scientific mind that fostered them. Some were placed in urns rich with old carving, and others in common garden pots. Some crept serpent-like along the ground, or climbed on high, using whatever means of ascent was offered them. One plant had wreathed itself round a statue of Vertumnus, which was thus quite veiled and shrouded in a drapery of hanging foliage, so happily arranged that it might have served as sculpture for a study. Now, all of this is what is an extensive description of the garden. These extensive descriptions are very common in old literature, but they are done in purpose. First, they are done to make the reader so interested into the story, and to make his imagination work, and to make him live within the story itself. So that's why they do it. It's very easy to summarize all of this by saying that the garden is beautiful and has many plants and the water is running, etc. But no, they go out of their way to use very difficult words sometimes, pompous language, to have this effect. While Giovanni stood at the window, he heard a rustling behind the screen of leaves. One thing that I should also mention is that not all of these details are done just for that sake, but many of these details will play a big role in the story. As we said, everything is done and put in purpose. While Giovanni stood at the window, he heard the rustling behind the screen of leaves, and became aware that a person was at work in the garden. His figure soon emerged into view, and showed itself to be that of no common laborer, but a tall, emaciated, sallow, and sickly-looking man, dressed in a scholar's garb of black. He was beyond the middle term of life, with grey hair and thin grey beard, and a face singularly marked with intellect and cultivation, but which could never, even in his more youthful days, have expressed much warmth of heart. So this is another description of a person that arrives to the scene. Nothing could exceed the intentness with which this scientific gardener examined every shrub which grew in his path. It seemed as if he was looking into their inmost nature, making observations in regard to their creative essence, and discovering why one leaf grew in this shape and another in that, and wherefore such and such flowers differed among themselves in hue and perfume. Nevertheless, in spite of the deep intelligence on his part, there was no approach to intimacy between himself and these vegetable existences. On the contrary, he avoided their actual touch, or the direct inhaling of their odors, with a caution that impressed Giovanni most disagreeably, for the man's demeanour was that of one walking among malignant influences, such as savage beasts, or deadly snakes, or evil spirits, which, should he allow them one moment of license, would wreak upon him some terrible fatality. It was strangely frightful to the young man's imagination to see this air of insecurity in a person cultivating a garden, that most simple and innocent of human toils, and which had been alike the joy and labor of the unfallen parents of the race. Was this garden, then, the Eden of the present world? And this man, with such perception of harm in what his own hands caused to grow, was he the Adam? So this is a very interesting passage. Still, we are describing this new character. Most likely it is Rappaccini, maybe. We can deduce a lot of his characteristics just from this description. Again, we are getting this information from the perspective of Giovanni. So we should also always take it with a grain of salt when the author is trying to, or in this case, it's the narrator. When the narrator is independent, but at the same time, he tells the account from the perspective of the character. So at this point, you can no longer take his description to be 100% the reality of the matter. It's subjective. And sometimes even the independent narrator is not someone to take objectively. Sometimes it can be used in a manipulative way to manipulate you to go to a certain narrative, and then later on it would be a plot twist, and you will find out that it was a form of manipulation within the story. At the end here, this is a rhetoric question. It's not really a serious question. It's an ironic question, which means that, of course, that's not the way that a person should handle the garden, especially as beautiful as this one. But still, why did he make this comparison or metaphor? Garden of Eden, as well as Adam and Eve. He puts it there for a reason, to use it later on. The distrustful gardener, while plucking away the dead leaves or pruning the too luxuriant growth of the shrubs, defended his hands with a pair of thick gloves. Nor were these his only armor, when, in his walk through the garden, he came to the magnificent plant that hung its purple gems beside the marble fountain. He placed a kind of mask over his mouth and nostrils, as if all this beauty did but conceal a deadlier malice. But finding his task still too dangerous, he drew back, removed the mask, and called loudly, but in the infirm voice of a person affected with inward disease. Beatrice, Beatrice, here am I, my father. What would you? I would have liked someone to, or a woman to, read the passages of the daughter, but it's not possible. Cried a rich and youthful voice from the window of the opposite house, a voice as rich as tropical sunsets. and which made Giovanni, though he knew not why, think of deep hues of purple or crimson, and of perfumes heavily delectable. Are you in the garden? Yes, Beatrice, answered the gardener, and I need your help. Soon there emerged from under a sculptured portal the figure of a young girl, arrayed with as much richness of taste as the most splendid of the flowers, beautiful as they, and with a bloom so deep and vivid that one shade more would have been too much. She looked redundant with life, health, and energy, all of which attributes were bound down and compressed, as it were, and girdled tensely in their luxuriance by her virgin zone. Yet Giovanni's fancy must have grown morbid while he looked down into the garden, for the impression which the fair stranger made upon him was as if he were another flower, the human sister of those vegetable ones, as beautiful as they, more beautiful than the riches of them, but still to be touched only with a glove, nor to be approached without a mask. As Beatrice came down the garden path, it was observable that she handled and inhaled the odor of several of the plants, which her father had most sedulously avoided. All right, this is one of the best descriptive passages of a woman you can ever find in literature. I mean, you can imagine how pretty Beatrice is. That's her name. So we are given the name of the daughter. Her name is Beatrice. That's a pretty name also. Again, we also can notice something else, which is the difference between how Beatrice dealt with the flowers and the garden in general, and how her father is dealing with it. So she inhales the odors, she touches the flowers, no issues. But why? That's the secret. Here, Beatrice, said the latter, see how many needful offices require to be done to our chief treasure. Yet, shattered as I am, my life might pay the penalty of approaching it so closely as circumstances demand. Henceforth, I fear this plant must be consigned to your sole charge. So there's a danger on his life in relation to the flowers, the garden. But he delegates this to his daughter. How come? Doesn't make sense. He's a human and she's a human. Maybe. And gladly will I undertake it, cried again the rich tones of the young lady, as she bent towards the magnificent plant, and opened her arms as if to embrace it. Yes, my sister, my splendor. It shall be Beatrice's task to nurse you, and you shall reward her with bee kisses and perfume breath, which to her is as the breath of life. Sorry, can you close your mic, please? Thank you. Right, so I was saying, let me repeat this passage because it's also very beautiful. And gladly will I undertake it, cried again the rich tones of the young lady, as she bent towards the magnificent plant and opened her arms as if to embrace it. Yes, my sister, my splendor, it shall be Beatrice's task to nurse and serve thee, and thou shalt reward her with thee kisses and perfume breath, which to her is as the breath of life. That's why Giovanni earlier said that she is like the sister of these plants. She's acting as if she were, or maybe she actually is. Maybe this is not simply a metaphor, but maybe it's true. Then, with all the tenderness in her manner that was so strikingly expressed in her words, she busied herself with such attentions as the plant seemed to require, and Giovanni, at his lofty windows, rubbed his eyes, and almost doubted whether it were a girl tending her favorite flower, or one sister performing the duties of affection to another. So again, the mention of sisterhood. The scene soon terminated. Whether Dr. Rappaccini had finished his labors in the garden, or that his watchful eye had caught the stranger's face, he now took his daughter's arm and retired. Night was already closing in. Oppressive exhalations seemed to proceed from the plants, and steal upward past the open window, and Giovanni, closing the lattice, went to his couch, and dreamed of a rich flower and beautiful girl. Flower and maiden were different and yet the same, and fraught with some strange peril in either shape. Here we can get an idea also about the character of Giovanni, but maybe this applies to every man, especially after seeing such a pretty view, whether it is the garden or the beautiful girl itself. He's so quick to dream about her directly. However, what is interesting here is that the narrator mentions peril, with some strange peril in either shape. So, as earlier mentioned or described, the garden has an exotic aura around it. Yes, it's very beautiful, but there is something weird about it. Something scary, not even just weird. It's exotic. That's what we mean by exotic. And beauty sometimes can be exotic. It's so beautiful that it is scary. Maybe Beatrice is just like that. But there is an influence in the light of morning that tends to rectify whatever errors of fancy or even of judgment we may have incurred during the sun's decline, or among the shadows of the night, or in the less wholesome glow of moonshine. This is also a great passage, and I believe it applies to all of us. Sometimes you have some thoughts or some worries, but once you wake up the next morning, your thoughts settle down and you can think clearly, much better than previously. So that's the influence of the light of the morning. So maybe Giovanni is thinking now of something new and arranging his thoughts about all of what he saw. Giovanni's first movement on starting from sleep was to throw open the window and gaze down into the garden which his dreams had made so fertile of mysteries. It seems that his sleep did not help in making him any less interested about all of this. He was surprised and a little ashamed to find how real and matter-of-fact an affair it proved to be. In the first rays of the sun, which gilded the dewdrops that hung upon leaf and blossom, and, while giving a brighter beauty to each rare flower, brought everything within the limits of ordinary experience. So it's even prettier than the scene he saw yesterday. It is the limits of ordinary experience. Nothing could exceed this, except paradise. The young man rejoiced that in the heart of the barren city he had the privilege of overlooking this spot of lovely and luxuriant vegetation. It would serve, he said to himself, as a symbolic language to keep him in communion with nature. Now, I should mention here that this story was written in the Romantic period. Now, when we say romantic, we are not talking about modern romance as people understand it. It's not the love story of a man and a woman. Nothing to do with that. I was also surprised the first time I learned about this. The Romanticist period or movement, it was a time where the Industrial Revolution was taking place and nature was being harmed and natural places were reduced, pollution started, etc. You already know the rest. So a lot of people, especially intellectuals, uh, they started some sort of revolution. At least it's an intellectual revolution. Did not take form in war or armed resistance, but it was intellectual, and that's what or how we find this Romanticist period or literary movement. Overall, the main idea is that uh, the human being needs nature and should always stay in contact with nature, and they felt a sense of longing and belonging to nature. So they always mention this in their writings. So that's what the author is doing here. Because he says that in Padua, it's a barren city. A barren city is the same way as we have now. And even then, it was less than now. Now it's even worse. So this beautiful garden serves as a way to keep in contact with nature. Anyway, neither the sickly and thought-worn Dr. Giacomo Rappaccini, it is true, nor his brilliant daughter were now visible, so that Giovanni could not determine how much of the singularity which he attributed to both was due to their own qualities, and how much to his wonder-work in fancy. But he was inclined to take a most rational view of the whole matter. So here we have the first direct mention of this dichotomy between Rappaccini and his daughter, Beatrice. Because Giovanni here thinks of Rappaccini in a total opposite way than how he sees Beatrice. So he thinks in terms of dichotomy. In the course of the day, he paid his respects to Signor Pietro Baglioni, professor of medicine in the university, a physician of eminent repute, to whom Giovanni had brought a letter of introduction. The professor was an elderly personage, apparently of genial nature, which means he was a genius, and habits that might almost be called jovial. Jovial, it means happy, joyful, generous, etc. He kept the young man to dinner and made himself very agreeable by the freedom of liveliness of his conversation, especially when warmed by a flask or two of Tuscan wine. Giovanni conceiving the men of science, inhabitants of the same city, must needs be on familiar terms with one another, took an opportunity to mention the name of Dr. Rappaccini. But the professor did not respond with so much cordiality as he had anticipated. Now we are introduced to another character, which is Baglioni. He is the professor and a physician university. L will this become a teacher of the divine art of medicine, said Professor Pietro Baglione in answer to a question of Giovanni. To withhold due and well-considered praise of a physician so eminently skilled as Rappaccini. So here, in a nutshell, he says that it is not possible to not praise Rappaccini for his skill, at least. But they say that everything before but does not count. But on the other hand, I should answer it but scantily to my conscience. Were I to permit a worthy youth like yourself, Signor Giovanni, the son of an ancient friend, to imbibe erroneous ideas respecting a man who might hereafter chance to hold your life and death in his hand. So it's like he's warning him that this man is dangerous. The truth is, our worshipful Dr. Rappaccini has as much science as any member of the faculty, with perhaps one single exception in Padua, or all Italy. But there are certain grave objections to his professional character. So now he's criticizing him, but in a way that is, you know, discreet or indirect. Because while he's criticizing, he's also praising. So what could that mean? When they say here worshipful, this is just a way to express respect. It's not, doesn't mean that they are worshipped or anything, but it probably means that they are devoted to God, or that they are very respected. That's all. Also, we should notice that he says there is only one exception, but he does not specify. We are inclined to think that he probably means himself. He is the only exception, maybe. Again, I'm doing this just to show you how should the reader experience literature. Don't just read for the sake of reading and to finish as quickly as possible. Your experience would be greatly hard. However, you should, for every passage at least, try to take one or two observations or one or two details that you think stand out. Because more times than not, these details are the ones that play a big role in the plot. And what are they? Asked the young man. Has my friend Giovanni any disease of body or heart, that he is so inquisitive about physicians? Said the professor, with a smile. But as for Rappaccini, it is said of him, and I, who know the man well, can answer for its truth, that he cares infinitely more for science than for mankind. His patients are interesting to him only as subjects for some new experiment. He would sacrifice human life, his own among the rest, or whatever else, sorry, or whatever else was dearest to him, for the sake of adding so much as a grain of mustard seed to the great heap of his accumulated knowledge. So now he is direct in his criticism, and basically he is calling him a mad scientist, the kind of scientist that does not have any ethics or morals. He's an immoral scientist, and whatever means necessary are justified for the sake of the result. Methinks he is an awful man, indeed, remarked Guasconti, mentally recalling the cold and purely intellectual aspect of Rappaccini. But now he is sort of approving his already perceived idea or impression. Now he's hearing something that justifies his first impression. It is a form of confirmation. And yet, worshipful professor, is it not a noble spirit? Are there many men capable of so spiritual a love of science? But here we can see that Giovanni is not, uh, how should we say it? He's not a naive person, and he thinks for himself. He could have just taken the testimony of Baglioni and said, especially with his already first impression, and said, yes, he's a bad man, but he's still giving him the benefit of the doubt. And since he is also a student of knowledge in this university, he's trying to see it from the good side. I mean, this man is so interested in science that should be commendable also. God forbid, answered the professor, somewhat testily. At least, unless they take sounder views of the healing art than those adopted by Rappaccini. It is his theory that all medicinal virtues are comprised within those substances which we term vegetable poisons. These he cultivates with his own hands, and is said even to have produced new varieties of poison, more horribly deleterious than nature. Without the assistance of this learned person, would ever have plagued the world withal. So before we continue this passage, he says that first he disagrees. He disagrees with Giovanni. He doesn't consider it as a spiritual love for science. Why? Because it is immoral. That's his stance. That's why he says, at least they should take a sounder views of the healing art. So Rappaccini, his theory is that the cure should always be taken from poison. That's his theory. And based on this, he created new forms of plants that are more poisonous than the natural poisonous plants. So maybe the garden that we already saw is the one that has these poisonous plants. Not just maybe, but certainly. And this explains the way he deals with these plants. But this does not explain how Beatrice, such a beautiful lady, can deal with it without being hurt. All right, where did we stop? Yeah, that the senior sorry, I have a notification. That the senior doctor does less mischief than might be expected with such dangerous substances is undeniable. Now and then, it must be owned, he has effected or seemed to effect a marvelous cure. But to tell you my private mind, Signor Giovanni, you should receive little credit for such instances of success, they being probably the work of chance, but should be held strictly accountable for his failure, which may justly be considered his own work. Now he says that he should not be credited for his marvelous cure. It means that he actually did come up with marvelous cure using this theory. But Baglioni disagrees with it and says that this success is in fact a form of failure. Why? We can theorize about why. First, as we said earlier, he thinks that it is unethical, immoral. Therefore, means do not justify the end. That's his position, maybe. Or maybe it is something else. You should always consider different narratives and guess which one is the correct one. It would give you some sort of pleasure when you find out that you guessed it right at the end. But we can notice that Baglioni is not being rational totally. Because how can you say that this or this marvelous cure should not be credited to his success? It does not make sense. The youth might have taken Baglioni's opinions with many grains of allowance. Had he known that there was a professional warfare of long continuance between him and Dr. Rappaccini, in which the latter was generally thought to have gained the advantage, if the reader be inclined to judge for himself, we refer him to certain black letter tracts on both sides, preserved in the medical department of the University of Padua. This is, even though it is a very small passage, but it's so interesting. It plays a big role in the story. Why? Because again, it shows that Giovanni is a smart individual. He did not take the words of Baglioni uh, for granted. He says here that he took it with many grains of allowance. It means many grains of salt. He did not believe him 100%. Then he also concludes that there was, and again, this is the narrator who is talking, but again, from the perspective of Giovanni. So even Giovanni is guessing this. This is the meaning. He is guessing that there is actually some sort of feud or battle between Baglioni and Rappaccini, the two physicians. So if he knew that there was this feud, he would have not brought him up anyways. And again, here in the last sentence, he says that he's talking now to us readers. He says that if the reader be inclined to judge for himself, which means you as the reader, if you should now judge. And it's good to do so. Even though you did not reach the end of the story, you do not know everything about both characters. But still, this is the beauty and the enjoyment of reading literature. You should here guess which one is on the right. Then the narrator says, we refer him to certain black letter tracts on both sides, preserved in the medical department of the University of Padua. It means that if you need or if you want to judge, you should go to the department of University of Padua and look at their researches, etc., to truly understand which one is correct. I know not, most learned professor, returned Giovanni, after musing on what had been said of Rappaccini's exclusive zeal for science. I know not how dearly this physician may love his art, but surely there is one object more dear to him. He has a daughter. Aha! Cried the professor with a laugh. So now our friend Giovanni's secret is out. You have heard of this daughter, whom all the young men in Padua are wild about, though not half a dozen have ever had the good hap to see her face. I know little of the Signora Beatrice, save that Rappaccini is said to have instructed her deeply in his science, and that, young and beautiful as fame reports her, she is already qualified to fill a professor's chair. Perchance, her father destines her for mine. Other absurd rumors there be, not worth talking about or listening to. So now, Signor Giovanni, drink off your glass of lacrima. Lacrima is some sort of wine. Again, continuing with the very important passage. What should we take away from this? Giovanni brings up the daughter of Rappaccini to Baglioni. First, Baglioni laughs and kind of teases Giovanni. Why? Because he thinks that he is in love with her, as every man, or at least every young man in Padua, even though very few people have seen her. But the rumors spread, and what is hidden is even more prettier. This is seen and experienced even for us. And this is the principle of scarcity. Even in Islam, we have this for women. Women who are covering themselves are even more wanted than those who are not. Right? So at first he teases him, and then he brings up some rumors, or at least I think this is factual because he says, I know little, save that. So he knows that Rappaccini has instructed Beatrice, so she is his student as well as his daughter. And he says that there are absurd rumors, but he mentions one, and he does not include it in the rumors. Why? He says that she is already qualified to fill a professor's chair. Perchance her father distance her from mine. So he says that Rappaccini wants to replace me with his daughter. And then right after he says other absurd rumors there be. So he kind of insinuates that this is just a rumor, but he made sure to say it. He made sure to mention it. So here it should give you an idea about Baglioni. There is some sort of jealousy going on, and he tries to believe in whatever that makes Rappaccini some sort of an evil person, even though he has no proof of this. Okay, this is something that can be understood. This is not you using headcanon. No, this is something that you can understand from this passage. The author wants you to understand this. The way he places these sentences is intentional. It's not just like that. This is how you can understand the story much better than people who just read for the sake of reading. Not even for the sake of reading, they just read and think that they enjoy literature and so on. They are, I would like to call them, or at least one professor of mine liked to call them asleep readers. They read while they are asleep. They simply understand the surface of the story and think, wow, this is great. Yes, the author makes a great story on the surface, but it's even greater if you understood what's beneath it. All right, let's continue. Ascending to his chamber, he seated himself near the window. But within the shadow thrown by the depth of the wall, so that he could look down into the garden with little risk of being discovered. So he does not want to be seen. Why? We should ask why. All beneath his eye was a solitude. The strange plants were basking in the sunshine, and now and then nodding gently to one another, as if in acknowledgement of sympathy and kindred. Kindred, I believe, here is kindness, but this is Old English. In the midst, by the shattered fountain, grew the magnificent shrub, with its purple gems clustering all over it. They glowed in the air and gleamed back again out of the depths of the pool, which thus seemed to overflow with colored radiance from the rich reflection that was steeped in it. At first, as we have said, the garden was a solitude. Soon, however, as Giovanni had half hoped, half feared would be the case, a figure appeared beneath the antique sculptured portal and came down between the rows of plants. inhaling their various perfumes, as if she were one of those beings of old classic fable that lived upon sweet odors. So again, we have, almost fantastic descriptions of Beatrice, adding to her uh, beauty, adding to her feel, aura maybe, even though aura is used for men mostly. On again beholding Beatrice, the young man was even startled to perceive how much her beauty exceeded his recollection of it. So brilliant, so vivid in its character. She glowed amid the sunlight, and as Giovanni whispered to himself, positively illuminated the more shadowy intervals of the garden path. So she is even prettier than the last time he saw her. Or maybe that's just his mind, his imagination. But sometimes when something is so beautiful, your mind cannot perceive the degree of how beautiful it is. And then, therefore, you sometimes think it is much more pretty the second time, or sometimes even less. So it happens both ways. Her face being now more revealed than on the former occasion. So now maybe this is the reason. Her face is more revealed. You can see it clearly. He was struck by its expression of simplicity and sweetness, qualities that had not entered into his idea of her character, and which made him ask anew what manner of mortal she might be, which means what kind of mortal she is. She almost looks like something out of a fantasy fable. Nor did he fail again to observe or imagine an analogy between the beautiful girl and the gorgeous shrub that hung its gem-like flowers over the fountain, a resemblance which Beatrice seemed to have indulged a fantastic humor in heightening, both by the arrangement of her dress and the selection of its hues. So this shrub almost looks like the plant version of Beatrice. Approaching the shrub, she threw open her arms, as with passionate ardor, and drew its branches into an intimate embrace, so intimate that her features were hidden in its leafy bosom, and her glistening ringlets all intermingled with the flowers. Bosom is the chest. It's between the upper and lower part of the chest of the woman. Glistening is glowing, lightning. Ringlets are the curly parts of the hair. "Give me thee breath, my sister," exclaimed Beatrice, "for I am faint with common air, and give me this flower of thine, which I separate with gentlest fingers from the stem, and place it close beside my heart." I love this expression so much, but also it says a lot about who Beatrice is, her nature. From this passage, you can guess a lot about Beatrice. First, she asks the breath. Again, she is humanizing the plants, or she is making herself plant-like. But we can give the edge to humanizing the plant. So she's asking her to give her its odor, obviously, its perfume. At first glance, you can say, well, everyone likes to smell flowers. But then she adds, "For I am faint with common air." If this was just a form of metaphor, it would be such a great metaphor first. For I am faint with common air. Maybe because she is so pretty, so non-ordinary, everything about her is not ordinary, that common air is poisonous to her. So this could be a metaphor for her beauty and excellence, etc. Or it could be actually real. It could be that common air, oxygen, that all of humans breathe, is fatal, or at least some sort or some way harmful to her. So these are two narratives. Which one will the story take? That's what we will discover. Maybe there are other narratives. We can sit here and imagine and think about it. With these words, the beautiful daughter of Rappaccini plucked one of the richest blossoms of the shrub and was about to fasten it in her bosom. But now, unless Giovanni's draughts of wine had bewildered his senses, a singular incident occurred. A small orange-colored reptile of the lizard or chameleon species chanced to be creeping along the path. Just at the feet of Beatrice, it appeared to Giovanni, but at the distance from which he gazed, he could scarcely have seen anything so minute. It appeared to him, however, that a drop or two of moisture from the broken stem of the flower descended upon the lizard's head. For an instant, the reptile contorted itself violently, and then lay motionless in the sunshine. Beatrice observed this remarkable phenomenon, and crossed herself sadly, but without surprise. Nor did she therefore hesitate to arrange the fatal flower in her bosom. There it blushed, and almost glimmered with the dazzling effect of a precious stone, adding to her dress and aspect the one appropriate charm, which nothing else in the world could have supplied. But Giovanni, out of the shadow of his window, bent forward and shrank back, and murmured and trembled. So something happened, something very weird, even more non-ordinary than Beatrice herself happened. Something fell from the flower on this creature, on this lizard, and it died. Am I awake? Have I my senses? Said he to himself. What is this being? Beautiful shall I call her, or inexpressibly terrible? So now there is a change in the way that Giovanni is looking at Beatrice. Now it is not the dichotomy that we talked about earlier. Now within Beatrice herself, there is a dichotomy. Giovanni now understands that she is so mysterious, so exotic, and that she could be dangerous behind that mask of beauty. Beatrice now strayed carelessly through the garden, approaching closer beneath Giovanni's window, so that he was compelled to thrust his head quite out of its concealment, in order to gratify the intense and painful curiosity which he excited. At this moment, there came a beautiful insect over the garden wall. It had perhaps wandered through the city and found no flowers nor verdure among those antique haunts of men, until the heavy perfumes of Dr. Rappaccini's shrubs had lured it from afar. Without alighting on the flowers, this winged brightness seemed to be attracted by Beatrice, and lingered in the air and fluttered about her head. Now here it could not be but that Giovanni Guasconti's eyes deceived him, but that as it might, he fancied that while Beatrice was gazing at the insects with childish delight, it grew faint and fell at her feet. Its bright wings shivered. It was dead. from no cause that he could discern, unless it were the atmosphere of her breath. Again Beatrice crossed herself and sighed heavily, as she bent over the dead insect. Now Beatrice uh, makes a reaction. We have here two similar incidents, both involving Beatrice and some sort of creature, a living creature, aside of the plants. In both cases, these living creatures died. In both cases, both of these living creatures died from something that relates to both the garden and Beatrice. In the first instance, we can clearly understand. Obviously, we already have the information that the garden is full of poisonous flowers. So obviously, it makes sense that when those drops that dropped on this lizard caused his death, because he's a little bean and few drops are enough to kill it. However, in the second incident, we cannot explain this the same way. The the insect uh, did not die from a plant, did not come across or in contact with any plant. Yes, maybe we can say that the odors of the plant. Yeah, that's a possibility. But it seemed like, from the way that Giovanni described the incidents, is that something about Beatrice was the cause of the death of this insect. So again, we are still discovering more and more about Beatrice. And still, Giovanni himself is discovering Beatrice. An impulsive movement of Giovanni drew her eyes to the window. So she notices Giovanni looking at her. There she beheld the beautiful head of the young man, rather a Grecian than Italian head, with fair, regular features, and the glistening of gold among his ringlets, gazing down upon her like a being that hovered in midair. Scarcely knowing what he did, Giovanni threw down the bouquet which he had hitherto held in his hand. So Beatrice notices Giovanni for the first time. She looks at him. Here we have the first description of Giovanni. So now we are in page 7. And it's the first instance where we have the description of possibly the main character. So now we understand that if you want to write a piece of literature, whether it is novel or short story, it is not impulsive or necessary to start always with describing the character. Yes, you would like to give the reader as better image as possible, but sometimes it's better to keep him curious, excited. And then, of course, you will eventually describe it. So Giovanni looks more Grecian than Italian, most likely because of his gold ringlets, because that's classic Greek man. Anyways, Giovanni threw down the bucket which he held in his hand. Signora, said he, there are pure and healthful flowers. Wear them for the sake of Giovanni Guasconti. Thanks, Signora, replied Beatrice, with her rich voice that came forth as it were like a gush of music. and with a mirthful expression, half childish and half woman-like. I accept your gift, and would fain recompense it with this precious purple flower. But if I toss it into the air, it will not reach you. So Signor Goscanti must have, or must even content himself with my thanks. She lifted the bouquet from the ground, and then, as if inwardly ashamed at having stepped aside from her maidenly reserve to respond to a stranger's greeting, passed swiftly homeward through the garden. But, few as the moments were, it seemed to Giovanni when she was on the point of vanishing beneath the sculptured portal, that his beautiful bouquet was already beginning to wither in her grasp. It was an idle thought. There could be no possibility of distinguishing a faded flower from a fresh one at so great a distance. Now let's stop here a second. This is a monumental event in the short story. The first contact or conversation between Giovanni and Beatrice. So what do you think about this conversation? It seemed natural, and it seemed that Giovanni forgot all about his worries. The moment that he looked at her, he no longer felt scared or worried or perplexed. He was actually excited, and he made sure to introduce himself and to let her know about him. He could have uh, disappeared quickly the moment he notices, because when we talk about literature, we should always use the present. So when he notices her gazing at him, he could have escaped the scene, but he made sure to talk to her. So again, we are discovering more about Giovanni as well. It seems like he is a victim of her beauty. Yes, he thinks to himself about all of these things, but without any effort from her side, she seems to be in control of the situation, even though she is oblivious to the whole situation. She did not know that he was looking at her. And also, we can discover more about Beatrice as well. It seems like she is good at holding a conversation. She is not someone who is afraid or has social anxiety, even though she looks like she is secluded in this place, because Baglioni earlier says that half a dozen people in the whole city were able to look at her. But she was able to hold this conversation well and express her gratitude, etc. So that's something to take in consideration. Now, moving forward, something also happened. This is another incident, quite like the previous two incidents that happened before. When she took in her hand the bouquet of flowers, and while she was escaping quickly, it was clear that after she said thanks, she took them out quickly. She did not stay to hold the conversation further. This could be the reason of many things. Maybe she is shy, especially that she has all these feminine qualities. Being shy is definitely one of them. Maybe she is afraid of the reaction of Rappaccini, her father. She knows that he is always watchful. Or maybe something else happened, which is what Giovanni notices. He notices that, and though he says that it is an idle thought, because It was so minute, so small, and it happened quickly. So he did not give it much thought. But it looked like the flowers that he gave her started to wither. To wither, it means to lose life. It it was already dead, but when you pluck a flower, it takes time for it to appear dead. So it was still beautiful, obviously. He bought it during that day. But while she was going, it looked like it started to wither. So what could be the reason? If you connect the dots, you can already understand. You can already guess the reason why. All right, this is the last passage before we end this session. For many days after this incident, the young man avoided the window that looked into Dr. Rappaccini's garden, as if something ugly and monstrous would have blasted his eyesight. Had he been betrayed into a glance, he felt conscious of having put himself, to a certain extent, within the influence of an unintelligible power, by the communication which he had opened with Beatrice. Now you can see, he starts to be conscious about the power that Beatrice has on him. But he's resistant, because as we observed earlier, he is a smart individual. The wisest course would have been, if his heart were in any real danger, to quit his lodgings in and Padua itself at once. So he says that the best thing he can do is actually leave everything. This mystery is not worth it. This is too dangerous. This is the first thought his rational mind is giving him. The next wiser, to have accustomed himself as far as possible to the familiar and daylight view of Beatrice, thus bringing her rigidly and systematically within the limits of ordinary experience. Now this is an illusion, all right? This is not something that can ever be done. But especially men will understand this. Sometimes we trick ourselves into doing something while we know that it would not succeed. We are conscious about it, yet we fool ourselves rationally into taking the opposite decision. This happens a lot when it comes to women. But that's the same thing happening here to Giovanni. He says that he should get accustomed to her so much that it becomes normal. But is that possible? Especially in the case of Beatrice. Yes, you can be accustomed to a certain degree to not always be struck and lose words when you look at her. But if she is that pretty and that different, you will always be aware of how she is pretty and different. So it can never become normal. But at least he is aware that this is the second option, not the first option. Thus, bringing her rigidly and systematically within the limits of ordinary experience. Least of all, while avoiding her sight, should Giovanni have remained so near this extraordinary being that the proximity and possibility even of intercourse, and intercourse here does not mean sex, it means just contact, should give a kind of substance and reality to the wild vagaries which his imagination ran riot continually in producing. So at least he says that, at least I can stop these imaginations that are running out of control. This is possible a little bit. Guasconti had not a deep heart, or at all events. Its depths were not sounded now, but he had a quick fancy, with an ardent southern temperament, which rose every instant to a higher fever pitch. So this is also another description, but now not an outwardly description, but for his character. So we discover here that Goskanti is not someone who falls in love so easily and is sentimental or emotional too much. No, it's the opposite. He does not have a deep heart. That's the meaning. The deep heart means that you are sentimental, over emotional, and sometimes also so loving, so tender, etc. So Giovanni is not this side. And he has an ardent temperament. Ardent temperament means he's quick to get angry or whatever feeling. Whether or no Beatrice possessed those terrible attributes, that fatal breath, the affinity with those so beautiful and deadly flowers, which were indicated by what Giovanni had witnessed, she had at least instilled a fierce and subtle poison into his system. It was not love, although her rich beauty was a madness to him, nor horror, even while he fancied her spirit to be imbued with the same baneful essence that seemed to pervade her physical frame, but a wild offspring of both love and horror that had each parent in it. This is also a great passage. Now we are talking about the sort of feelings and emotions that Giovanni is developing towards Beatrice. He is aware of her dangerous nature, but yet her beautiful nature sometimes overrides his awareness. And the result is that he is both so infatuated, so admiring of her, yet so terrified and so afraid. And that's why he calls it, or at least the narrator calls it, she instilled a subtle poison. A subtle poison. Now he is poisoned. Why? Because this is not in his nature. He did not, or he is not used to himself feeling these feelings. But now he is feeling them. That's her poison. Even though he is suspecting that she is poisonous in other ways. So this is sort of confirmation that she maybe have, or she may have, a fatal breath. The same as the flowers themselves. But a wild offspring of both love and horror that had each parent in it, and burned like one and shivered like the other. Giovanni knew not what to dread, still less did he know what to hope. Yet hope and dread kept a continual warfare in his breast, alternately vanquishing one another and starting up afresh to renew the contest. So now he is conflicted. He does not know whether he should hope that the results or the truth is something beautiful, and he was just worrying without any real cause, or should he dread and lose all hope and realize that this person, this entity, is so dangerous that he should not get in contact or mess with her. Blessed are all simple emotions, be they dark or bright. It is the lurid intermixture of the two that produces the illuminating blaze of the infernal regions. This is one of the best quotes that you can ever find. Blessed are all simple emotions. Simple emotions are easy to handle. Even those simple sad or depressing feelings. If they are simple, you can deal with them. At least you know how to, and you know what are they. That's the first step to dealing with them and to solving them. But that's why he says, be they dark or bright. Yes. But that's complex and intermixed feeling when you have both sadness sometimes and happiness, joy and depression, boredom and excitement, all mixed at once. They light a flame in your heart. It's a blaze that you feel in your heart, and you do not know how to deal with them. You do not know how to approach yourself. It becomes very difficult. That's what they call melancholy. All right, melancholy is a term used for these complex feelings. But all complex feelings at the end of the day are dark. They cannot be bright, cannot be happy. All right, I think it's better to stop here. This is the introduction of the short story. We still have yet 13 pages, so this is the first part. Maybe there would be part 2 and part 3. I'm enjoying this story more and more each time. I actually keep understanding it even better the more I read it. And that's how you know that this is a great piece of art. So thank you for your presence, I should say. I would have liked if you had some something to say, some participation. What do you think about this story? Do you like it? Do you not? Feel free to share your thoughts. And if you liked the way that the session is going, then let me know so that I don't need to change anything. And if you have something to suggest, then please do so I can rectify what I can. All right, this is it. So see you in the next session, inshallah, to continue this wonderful short story. Goodbye and take care of yourself. You can leave your thoughts in the comment section of the YouTube video. Of course, I will be uploading that there. And if you have any suggestions, leave them there also. Goodbye, and don't forget to like and subscribe.